Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Greetings from Jerusalem across the world. We are so pleased to be together with our featured guest, Richard Ovenden, the Bodley's Librarian, Senior Executive of the Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford. This evening, this event is auspicious for many reasons. I'm excited to announce first here that the National Library of Israel and the Bodleian Libraries have just signed an historic agreement to cooperate in the digitization of Hebrew manuscripts. The National Library, in partnership with the Friedberg Manuscript Society, leads the Kativ Project, an international digital library of all known Hebrew manuscripts in the world. This year, we will have signed agreements with approximately 600 collections comprising approximately 80% of all known Hebrew manuscripts in the globe. The Bodleian Libraries at the University of Oxford house one of the most important collections of Hebrew letter manuscripts in the world. After many conversations in recent years, we are thrilled to share that the agreement will allow us to digitize selected ancient Hebrew manuscripts and enable access to the Bodleian's Hebrew manuscript collection, as the Bodleian continues to digitize their Hebrew manuscripts in the coming years. We look forward to continuing our joint work and to many more collaborations in the years to come. Our agreement with the Bodleian Libraries is an excellent example of the mutual cultural relations between Israel and the United Kingdom. It is therefore my great honor to invite His Excellency, the British Ambassador to Israel, Neil Wigan, to deliver introductory words to mark this very special event. Ambassador.
Thank you very much indeed. And I really am. I know I say this at every event, but this time I really mean it. I really am delighted to be here. Partly because these are two institutions that I really care about. So I studied at Oxford. So I spent some of the best hours, most enjoyable hours of my life, the most illuminating in every sense hours of my life at the Bodleian at Oxford, which for those of you who haven't had the extraordinary privilege to not just to see it from the outside, but to go inside, is a really extraordinary collection of books in an amazing selection of libraries and buildings of all sorts of different eras, and which has sort of a very British combination of lots of history, lots of tradition, but also this extraordinary collection of the most modern books, the most ancient books, and as we're hearing about today, now the most advanced digitization and other techniques to try to make this extraordinary amount of learning available to other people. So studying at the Bodleian was an experience which I was better than I deserved, and is a real highlight of my life. And for the National Library of Israel, so for the British people on the call who may not be so familiar with it, but the National Library sits sort of at the equivalent of Whitehall or Parliament Square. So it has the Prime Minister's office, the Supreme Court, the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, the Central Bank, all within a stone's throw of the new library building that's going up. And with which there's a very strong British connection. So it's supported heavily by Yad HaNadif, the Rothschild Family Foundation, which also built the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, and the Supreme Court, which are extraordinary buildings in their own right. And I know that they are, including Lord Rothschild and the family, are delighted that the National Library is going to be such a great project to accompany all of them. And I spend a lot of time in that area. And every day, every time I go back up, I see the building a little bit more progressed, and I'm really delighted to see it. So the collaboration that you talked about on the Kativ is fantastic. The Hebrew collection is a key thing for the Bodleian. So I know that the first books in Hebrew entered the collection in 1601, so over 400 years ago and less than a decade after the Bodleian was founded. By the first catalogue, there were 58 books in Hebrew in the catalogue, and a lot from Venice, which of course was the great centre of Jewish publishing at that time, and we're closely linked to Thomas Bodley. So I understand some of the manuscripts he even annotated himself in his own script. So to see this collection, including things like the Oppenheimer Library of the collection of the chief rabbi of Prague in the 19th century, to be part of the Kativ, I think, is a fantastic piece of collaboration. And I think that the topic for tonight could not be more appropriate. So I know that when the Bodleian was founded, as I say, in the 1590s, Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, said that the Bodleian should be an ark to save learning from the deluge. And that's something the Bodleian has done ever since, to preserve manuscripts, books, which otherwise probably would not have been preserved, so that scholars and now humanity will be able to have access to them. And that's a core part of its mission. And that's what the book talks so movingly about. And of course, that's a key part of the National Library of Israel's objective and identity as well. And clearly we're at a time when attacks on knowledge, attacks on learning, attacks on culture, as we've seen the things that ISIS did in Syria and elsewhere, demonstrate how relevant this is. But obviously, particularly the horrific attacks on Jewish culture, everything from the Nuremberg book burnings, burning works by Jewish and other authors, to the destruction of the library in Sarajevo, which the book talks about, to the horrific assault on Jewish culture throughout Europe. And preserving that culture and that extraordinary contribution to civilization, I know, is a key role of the National Library of Israel. So I recommend the book enormously. I have not yet finished it myself, but it is a truly fantastic book. But I can't think of a more appropriate topic to celebrate this fantastic collaboration. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ambassador Wigan, for your enthusiastic and inspiring remarks. And now to our featured guest of the evening. It is my great pleasure to introduce Richard Ovenden, who has been Bodley's librarian since 2014. Prior to that, he held positions at Durham University Library, the House of Lords Library, the National Library of Scotland, and the University of Edinburgh. He moved to the Bodleian in 2003 as Keeper of Special Collections, becoming Deputy Librarian in 2011. He was educated at the University of Durham and the University College London, and holds a professorial fellowship at Balliol College, Oxford. He is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, the Royal Society of Arts, and a member of the American Philosophical Society. He was made OBE, an officer of the Order of the British Empire, in the Queen's Birthday Honors in 2019. Richard serves as treasurer of the Consortium of European Research Libraries, as president of the Digital Preservation Coalition, and as a member of the board of the Council on Library and Information Services in Washington, D.C. His previous books include John Thompson, 1837 to 1921, photographer from 1997, a Radicals book written with Michael Hunter, Giles Mendenbrodt, and Nigel Smith from 1999, and the book we will be discussing this evening, Burning the Books, A History of Knowledge Under Attack, which was published in 2020, both by Harvard University Press and John Murray. Richard will begin with a short presentation based on his book, and then he and I will discuss key themes of cultural preservation and the threats to knowledge throughout history, and the daunting yet exciting challenges of the digital age. If you have questions, please write them down in the chat. Towards the end of our time together, we will take questions from the audience that you have written in the chat area. And now, Richard, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Raquel, and thank you also to Ambassador Wiggins for that very generous introduction. And just for my own part, before I begin my presentation, to say how excited we are in Oxford to be participating in this collaboration with the National Library of Israel. We value our holdings of Hebrew and Jewish manuscripts and early printed books, they're incredibly important to us. So being able to share them and to work with the National Library of Israel to make them more available is exactly the right thing to do at this time. And I'd also like to say that this is also a special day for another reason, and that's because we're able to announce today the endowment of our lead curator for Hebraica and Judaica, thanks to incredibly generous donations from Sir Victor Blank and from the Rothschild Foundation, Yav Hanadi Europe. So that's another reason for celebration this evening. I'd like to thank Sir Victor Blank and the Rothschild Foundation very, very much from my own heart. This is so important to us, and we're delighted to have the Victor Blank curator of Hebraica and Judaica on our staffing from now on in perpetuity. But let me share the screen, and I will begin by giving you a short presentation, and let me just get it. Now, I hope you can see that. Good. So my talk and my book are really about the history of attacks on knowledge, but also it's about the history of why preserving knowledge is so important for society, for communities, and for individuals. And there are a number of reasons why I thought the time was right to tackle this topic in the way that I have done. And I guess the first of those is actually rereading George Orwell. The first time I read him, I read 1984 for the first time as a teenager, and then coming back to reread him, having had a lengthy career in libraries and archives, and in this moment that we're living in right now, it seemed to speak in a very different and much more powerful way. And here is one quote that I'd like to share with you just to illustrate that. But I'd also been concerned more generally with how society was beginning to neglect the issue of preserving knowledge, that core task that society over millennia has passed to libraries and archives and to librarians and archivists to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. I felt that at the moment that we live in, that libraries are not getting the level of support or recognition or encouragement that they should be. The third reason was really the result of visiting the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin through another collaboration we have with the great library in that city. And a few years ago, I visited them and then just crossed Unter den Linden and stumbled upon the site of this activity that you can see on the screen in front of you. The 10th of May 1933 is when the great and terrible book burnings began, orchestrated by the Nazis, and where Jewish books and other materials were loaded together in a pyre and filmed at the time in a very kind of coordinated and theatrical event. And it struck me, visiting the site of these terrible activities, that this took place actually not that long ago. My mother was alive when these events took place, and how much we need to remember how fragile the world of knowledge is, even in the digital age, or perhaps even more so in the digital age. And speaking of which, the time that I began to write this book was not long after the events of January 2017 in Washington, D.C., when we first came across the phrase alternate facts in relation to the challenge that was posed to the world, I guess, by Kellyanne Conway, the presidential press secretary, relating to the number of people who may or may not have attended President Trump's inauguration as opposed to President Obama's. And then finally, I think the real trigger was learning of the destruction of landing records from the generation of immigrants invited to come and work in the United Kingdom after World War II from the British Empire, or the former British Empire, known as the Windrush generation. And at the time, from 2010, the British government had instituted a very aggressive policy of challenging that members of that generation through what became known as the hostile environment. But at the same time that they were posing great pressure, sometimes intense pressure, leading to a number of suicides and deaths of people from that generation, it turned out through a piece of investigative journalism that the very evidence that those individuals could have used to document their right to remain had been destroyed by the same government department who was instigating the policy. And this struck me as a great case study in why the preservation of knowledge is of vital importance, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. And I wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times, which directly led to me writing this book. But what I thought I'd do is just share a few case studies from the book with you. The first of these goes back to the ancient world. And here you see cuneiform tablets from the great library of Ashurbanipal, the ruler of Assyria in the 7th century before the Christian era, whose library was destroyed as Assyria, the great city of Nineveh, fell to a coalition of forces. But his library survived. It was the result of excavation in the 19th century. And from it, we know that he was deliberately targeting his neighboring states, his enemies like Babylonia, for books and documents in their collections, where he sought to bring knowledge to add to his own power and status in his great library in Nineveh. And then, of course, perhaps the most famous library in antiquity, the Great Library of Alexandria. And here you see one of our most treasured manuscripts, of the earliest surviving manuscript of Euclid's Elements. And Euclid wrote that book while studying at the Great Library of Alexandria. But the library has become famous today because of its destruction. And of course, that deliberate destruction, which many history books tell us. And I remember watching Carl Sagan's program Cosmos, with the first episode of which, when I was a teenager, recounted the destruction of the Great Library in a conflagration. But of course, actually, contemporary scholarship now suggests that there was no single act of destruction. There certainly were fires, but the library, the Great Library of Alexandria, ceased to exist not because of one cataclysmic event, but because of a gradual period of decline and neglect, as it lost its status, it lost its funding, it lost its patronage. And by the 4th or 5th century of the Christian era, it was no more. And a great tragedy that certainly was, but it was not the act of a single moment of destructive power. The same cannot be said of the medieval library of the University of Oxford. It began its life in the university church. And in fact, last year we celebrated the library's 700th anniversary of there being a university library in Oxford. Here's one of the early gifts to it, a medieval manuscript illuminated and given by a man called Gilbert Keimer, the Dean of Salisbury, in the 15th century. On the eve of the Reformation, that library, and here you can see the library room in Oxford that still exists. But on the eve of the Reformation, in the 1530s, there were over 400 books. It was one of the great secular libraries of Great Britain at that time. But by the end of the 1550s, none of those books remained in that room. The vast majority of them had been destroyed. A handful of them had fled the country with fleeing Catholics in the wake of a severe Protestant Reformation. The same activity took place in the medieval monasteries of Great Britain. Here you see the site of one of the greatest monastic houses, Glastonbury Abbey in the west of England, which suffered a cataclysmic destruction after 1539, when the abbot was accused of robbing the church and of blasphemy and of disloyalty to King Henry VIII, and he was hung, drawn and quartered on Glastonbury Tor, which then heralded the dispersal of all of the great wealth of that house, including its library. And many of those books were torn up, and pages only survive in the linings of book bindings of later printed books. And here you can see a couple of examples from the collection in the Bodleian. But astonishingly, we know we have access to a record of what those libraries were like from a man called John Leland, whose archive also happens to be in the Bodleian. And here we can see the books that he accessed in Glastonbury Abbey's library. And I ask you to look at the bottom of those entries: Grammatica Uticis Liber Olim Sancti Dunstani. And that very book, known today as the Class Book of St Dunstan, a great miscellany of texts from the 7th, 8th and 9th centuries, still exists in the Bodleian, and it only survives thanks to the activities of antiquaries and collectors, the greatest of whom in our history was, of course, Sir Thomas Bodley, who rebuilt the destroyed library of the university through his own wealth and energy, but also attracted others to save the books that had been rescued from the ruins of the monasteries and came to the Bodleian as a place of sanctuary, as Ambassador Wiggins said, an ark to save learning from the deluge. Fast forward in time to 1814, and here we have Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who commanded a British expeditionary force to the former American colonies, of course, to the United States. And in August 1814, I should say, they set fire to Washington, D.C. And we actually have an eyewitness account by an Oxford alum, like the ambassador, George Robert Gleig, who was witnessed the destruction of the Capitol building. They proceeded, he wrote, without a moment's delay to burn and destroy everything in the most distant degree connected with the government. All this was as it should be. And had the arm of vengeance been extended no farther, there would not have been room given for so much as a whisper of disapprobation. But unfortunately, it did not stop there. A noble library, several printing offices, and all the National Archives were likewise committed to the flames, which no doubt the property of government might better have been spared. And here you can see the Capitol building after that terrible fire. But it's actually another moment of destruction creates a moment of renewal. Just like Sir Thomas Bodley and Oxford, we have Thomas Jefferson in America in 1814 offering his private library to help rebuild this wound that had been inflicted upon the ability of the American government to understand through knowledge how best to govern its people. And in the Library of Congress today, there is a reconstruction of Jefferson's library. Of course, the Holocaust witnessed perhaps in one of the most terrible moments for the preservation of knowledge. Probably 100 million books were destroyed in World War II through the activities of the Nazi Holocaust, and none more terrible than in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius, or Vilna, as it was known at the time, a place of great libraries, a great learning, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, it was called. And here is one of those libraries, the Strashun. But there was an organization called YIVO, a center for the study of Jewish civilization and culture in Central and Eastern Europe, which collected great treasures like the diary of Theodor Herzl. But the Nazi regime sent in shock troops behind the Blitzkrieg to attack Jewish bodies of knowledge. And here you can see one terrible example, a Hebrew manuscript that was used perversely to form the canvas for a portrait of Arthur Seyss-Inquart, one of the leading Nazis in Austria. But again, the activities we see in Vilnius through a group of Jews who were known as the Paper Brigade, of Oyneg Shabes, led by Erwin Ringelblum in Warsaw, who risked their lives to preserve knowledge, to preserve books and manuscripts in the teeth of the most vicious Nazi destruction. And some of those books survived. Some of them came back to YIVO's successor organization in New York. And here you can see the staff of YIVO unpacking packing crates after World War II. And then again, we see the genocide of culture go alongside the genocide of human beings. Sadly, in Bosnia and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, here the National Library of Sarajevo attacked deliberately in 1992. And of course, last year we marked only 25 years since the massacre of Srebrenica. So that's just a few tasters of what is in my book, what are the kinds of topics I try to cover. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I think it's now time for Raquel and I to be in conversation.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you for sharing a little taste of the extraordinary book that you wrote. I enjoyed it immensely. I cheered, I cried, I went through all of the emotions. And I think I want to start by unraveling what I see as the two main threads that you alluded to in your presentation and you develop in great depth in your book. On the one hand, you talk about the many different ways that libraries as centers of learning and knowledge have been harmed throughout history, attacked, destroyed, cut down, neglected. And the message you get is how fragile a culture's collective memory is, and all the different reasons why culture and knowledge disappear. So that's what I would call the destructive thread in your book. On the other hand, there's a constructive thread. And really, you take us through this extraordinary, engaging, and illuminating history of libraries, starting from King Shorbanipal, who you mentioned earlier, in 7th century BCE Assyria, all the way to today. And that's a message of great hope and of heroism. One of the key messages, I think, from this book is that these libraries were built and preserved and rebuilt by individuals, by heroic individuals who risked their lives, gave their lives. And so we have these two threads, the destructive and the constructive. And you know, maybe it's my origins sitting in a library as head of collections at the National Library of Israel, but it seems to me that you've written a history of libraries through the lens of destruction. And so I'm interested in why you chose that lens. Why frame this history through the peril?
Well, I think that's a really good question, Raquel. I think I wanted to, what better way to understand why knowledge is so important, to look at what happens when you lose it. And not just what happens when there are kind of accidental, losses. And of course, there's many of those through history, and terrible fires and floods, but actually when it's targeted and what the motivations for that. So, religious reasons or, the political acts of one state against another, the kind of cultural underpinnings of these kind of things. And I think that understanding some of those losses and what cultures and societies and individuals suffer from when they lose libraries, but also to, at the same time, as you say, to try and, recognize the power of libraries and archives and the commitment of the staff who work in them, the supporters who, help them do what they do, the the donors, the collectors of books who work with libraries or who give money and so on. All of those communities work together to help knowledge pass down from one generation to the next and to improve the world by doing that.
You certainly have tapped into a deep current in our society and even across many different cultures. In the lead up to this event, we've actually been inundated by fascinating emails of people sharing stories and raising other cases. And so that leads me to my next question, and that is, I assume that there were other cases that you did not include. Unfortunately, there are many, many examples of, as you say, not just the accidents of history, but the willful destructions based on ideologically motivated attacks. Can you share with us some of the cases, or one or two cases that didn't make it into the book,
Sure.
and why?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're absolutely right. There are too many, depressingly, there are too many cases to include in the book. And I wanted to leave enough space for the case studies that I did tackle to be dealt with, appropriately, to be able to tell their story, those stories properly. But some of the things I left out, well, you can look at China during the Cultural Revolution and the kind of erasure of the past that took place under communist rule. At the end of World War II, there were similar activities that were taking place in Soviet Russia, and indeed, the part of how the YIVO collection survived was in defiance of communist instructions to send the YIVO collections to the paper mills outside Vilna as well. I think that obviously there are some terrible, I think the ambassador referred to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and of course there are kind of wonderful heroic and inspiring events that have been recently written up about Timbuktu and the libraries in Mali in the face of Al-Qaeda activities. But I thought there'd just been a very recent book on those, so it didn't need me to go over that territory again. So and indeed in nearer to home, the the Public Record Office in Dublin being destroyed in 1922, and there's a great project which we're involved with, led by the National Library of Ireland, National Archives of Ireland, and Trinity College Dublin, to reconstruct virtually that lost collection. So I could only write one volume.
Right.
That's all my publisher would allow me. So that's how I approached it.
So if we think about the cases that you did focus on, I wanted to think with you a little bit about taxonomy. And if we could tease apart the difference between military motivated destruction as a sign of power, of control, and religious, ideological motivated attacks and destruction too. And then there's other kinds of cultural destruction. Did you get a sense of patterns, or and maybe connections between the motive and the method? What did you learn from all of these tours? I have to say, I tried to follow, and I wasn't able to pick up patterns. I'm curious if you saw.
I don't think there's a very clear kind of pattern. Each individual case study has its own, sometimes very kind of fascinating and kind of absorbing contexts, and they are often different. In terms of kind of religiously motivated destructions, again, there are often often some of the combatants are conflicted with their desire to destroy what they regard as heretical texts and dangerous texts, with their desire to keep some of them because they're actually privately, they regard them as being very valuable. And you see that even with Henry VIII himself. There are great books which supported his own political and religious arguments which found their way through to the Royal Library, but the bulk of those texts were destroyed. And even in continental Europe, you see a kind of similar kind of thing happening. The Vatican Library ended up with the great Protestant library known as the Bibliotheca Palatina from Heidelberg, really because the Vatican wanted to know what the other side were thinking. So that sense that the theft of knowledge helps you become stronger, and it makes your enemy weaker. And you even see that going back to Ashurbanipal. I think that was his kind of motivations. And then sort of the political, the state versus another state, they tend to be more brutal and complete in their destructive intent, and often in their execution. And you see that again in Bosnia. There were whole libraries were really completely destroyed, and the targeting of provincial archives in Bosnia by the Serbs in order to eradicate any reference that Muslims had ever owned property. There was an intent to be as thorough as the Nazi regime were in their destruction. So they're the kind of patterns.
Yes, there is something distinctive or bizarre even about human tendencies here, because you have, in the Nazi case, on the one hand, it was just terrible destruction, civilizationally annihilating destruction, of course, of human beings, but also of literature. And at the same time, this desire to capture and catalog and preserve, right? It sounds like that wasn't unique to the Nazis, but it was something that you see throughout human history, of, on the one hand, the desire to stamp out, and then to save on the side. Or, you mentioned two different motivations here. I just want to pull them out. One was, you said that it was a secret respect or an interest. And then on the other hand, it was a desire to control, I think. Is that how you see it, or are there other motivations going on?
I think you can see both of those attributes going on. So you can certainly see, say, in Alfred Rosenberg's Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question, where many of the books that did survive the Holocaust ended up, is a kind of, a perverted research institute intended to understand why Jews were successful in many aspects of life, intellectually, culturally, in all sorts of ways. And so there was this kind of desire to, document and understand and study. And but you don't see that in say Bosnia. You see much more of a kind of a more destructive intent. And in say Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, you see the American forces taking almost the entire National Archives of Iraq back to the United States to digitize and to use new technology, text and data mining, to help find evidence of weapons of mass destruction. So there are that desire to understand and study, and almost to kind of break something through that process of studying, very evident. But you also see the more kind of brutal sort of complete destruction taking place, and sometimes both at the same time.
Right. I think I also was thinking of the word brutality. There's the brutal side of this, and then there's the pernicious conquest side of this, that are both in play. I want to turn to what one might call more of a subtle kind of attack. If we talk about the brutal destruction of the physical destruction of libraries and books and authors, and then there's the subtle form of attack in the form of censorship. Now, I looked around a little bit after I read the book. I went back and I felt that the theme of censorship is present in your book, but it's not central. And as a theme in and of itself. And so before we delve deeper, I actually want to pose that as why wasn't it a more central theme for you? Or was it and I missed it?
No, it wasn't a central theme. You're absolutely right, because I think partly because there would have been insufficient space to be able to kind of tackle it. You know, I do refer to the Roman Catholic Index, for example, and to, you know,
the great chapter on John Milton is
absolutely.
I think,
and you see, you know, again, a fascinating case study from Oxford, where you know, Milton is, you know, the copies of Milton's work after the restoration of the monarchy in the 17th century are taken into what is now the Bodleian's quadrangle and burned. And my predecessor, the fifth librarian, having kind of inherited a book in his collection from his predecessor, who was a friend of Milton, and was given, the library was given a special copy of Milton's books inscribed by the writer with a special poem dedicated to the Bodleian. That was hidden from that act of destruction. So, you know, that burning was a form of censorship, a kind of, you know, extreme form of censorship. In a sense, you know, the Reformation itself was a kind of extreme form of religious censorship. But I think censorship becomes something else when it comes to the moment of destruction. I think, you know, there's one thing to, you know, suppress the distribution of a text, and there's another to eradicate it completely.
Right.
And
I
think discussing censorship would have been
would be we've already created for you a multi-volume series. When I think about censorship, I do think about it in the subtle sense of it, because I have noticed in our own manuscript collection the role of the censor, especially in Hebrew manuscripts. You look at Hebrew manuscripts, particularly in Christian Europe, and you see the presence of the Catholic censor signing his name on a book that he has reviewed and sometimes crossed out things. So it's a much more subtle intervention than, you know, we talked about, you know, different levels of brutality of, you know, stamping out or stealing and locking away. What I loved about the case of the John Milton example that you mentioned is you, if you don't mind me quoting you back to yourself, you talk about the dilemma of the librarian in the 17th century after receiving this order to destroy John Milton's books, and John Milton had given his personal copies to the Bodleian as a place of the bastion of free speech. So it's a very poignant moment. And you say, should it bow to the pressure of the university authorities and relinquish the special volume, or should it preserve the volumes of the defender of free speech? Now, what ends up happening, as you mentioned, is they decide to sequester this book to hide it away from the general public. And what I found so interesting about that decision was it was an attempt to hide and even to censor or restrict access, I think is a better way to say it, to restrict access to this text in order to save it, in order to preserve it, with even a historical sensibility that maybe one day there'll be another time. And it reminded me of a number of cases that I dealt with when I first started working at the library, the National Library of Israel, and where we found that the librarians of the previous generation had restricted access to all sorts of material. And they didn't destroy it, and they didn't hide it away completely, but they created levels of access. And the categories were pornography, because all national libraries have legal deposit laws and so they get all sorts of material that they restrict access, and radical political material, which we thought were funny bedfellows. But what it meant is that a person could get access to the material. It wasn't destroyed, but it was restricted, and it's emblematic of the role of the librarian, let's say in the pre-open access era, where a librarian is a gatekeeper. One of the comments I just saw mentioned the name of the rose, and the name of the rose is a wonderful illustration of that old school approach to the role of the librarian. The librarian is the gatekeeper. How do you, I mean, I'd love to hear you reflect on your role in relation to others.
I'm so glad you raised this. This is a kind of, really interesting area. And I think that, I don't want to come across that, there's never been a librarian or an archivist that in history who's prevented access to knowledge, or prevented the sharing of knowledge, or that even has been complicit in destruction. There were many librarians in Nazi Germany who were, enthusiastic book burners and of Jewish texts. But I think there are, the more positive examples that I was trying to highlight were ones where and actually, this is another kind of issue in my book that I was trying to raise awareness of, and that is of libraries and archives as examples of long-term thinking. And so, and I hope in institutions like ours that is in the kind of the DNA of our organizations, that we're in it for the long haul.
Right.
And although, taking Milton's book out of circulation for a short period of time, and of course an irony, here's him talking about this issue: should you suppress all this flowery crop of knowledge and new lights spring up and yet spring daily in this city, wrote Milton. Librarians today don't, what they want to do is to give access to that flowery crop of knowledge.
Right.
But sometimes restricting access to it for a few years means, if it means that over a longer period of time, it can be read by others, it can be interpreted, it can seed new knowledge. That seems to me to be a trade-off that's worth taking place. And of course, the world is different now, information technology, but there are still many, many gatekeepers. But I think those key gatekeepers have shifted away from being librarians and archivists, and librarians and archivists are doing a very different role now.
That is, and I want to get now to the contemporary period, but I just want to share that in our library we talk about the long tail, that what is distinctive about our work as a national library, as opposed to a community library, which is very much about the media, making sure you get immediate access, is that we are worrying about we're in it for the long haul, as you said.
Yeah.
Now, censorship is a great segue to pivot to contemporary subjects. I would start by saying that we live in a profoundly interesting and complicated time, because I think human beings have never had such open access to literary material as in our day. I think, no question, we are in a completely different world of access on the one hand. On the other hand, there are so many challenges that we are dealing with. And if we're talking about censorship, then I want to dive right in and talk about what has been going on in the United States just in the last few weeks, where you had the president have all his social media accounts shut down because there was a decision among the leaders of these corporations that he had crossed some line between free speech and violence. And you were being prophetic or prescient in your writing when you talk about the massive role of big technology companies who are dominating the social management of knowledge. And you even use this great analogy to the role of the Catholic Church in the medieval period in terms of access to knowledge and access to data, and using that access to exercise social control. So you have this case study, if we can just spend a few minutes on the Trump case study, which is on the one hand, censorship that's happening from, let's say, from the good side, and yet these are corporations, private corporations, who are flexing these muscles and restricting access at a frightening level. What do you think? Help us navigate this.
I mean, it's yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, the digital world that we live in today is incredibly complex. It's incredibly fast moving. And in my book, I use a quote from my Oxford colleague, Timothy Garton-Ash, who in his book on free speech calls the big tech companies the private superpowers. And I think that's a you know, I really found that kind of resonated very well with me, and that's partly why I use the kind of analogy with the Roman Catholic Church, and partly because they have such you know, so many people use those platforms today and they can be harvested. The data that's created through that interaction with Google and Twitter and Facebook and so on can be harvested for all sorts of reasons, which we're only now beginning to understand. I mean, Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, just published just 2 years ago, really is was a kind of absolutely revelatory read for me about you know, the influence that can be had. And of course, we've seen through investigative journalism into the role of an organization called Cambridge Analytica working with Facebook and the 2016 presidential election, that we've seen how you know, that data, those clicks, those likes, those searches in Google, those likes on Facebook can be used for targeted political advertising as well as for commercial advertising. So I think that sort of the role of gatekeeper has now passed to the private superpowers. These are now, as we've seen with what their decision about President Trump's engagement with their platforms, they are the gatekeepers of knowledge. They are the censors of today. And I think, you know, all of these events are moving so fast that we have to kind of really take stock of how society is going to come to terms with the private superpowers that work across jurisdictions. They have enormous wealth. They can almost literally see into our souls by you know, data mining our online behavior. And how, as societies, we're going to, you know, behave as a result, either individually, and we're beginning to see calls for digital abstinence, and all sorts of, you know, approaches saying, you know, sort of convenience is overrated. And, you know, in Europe, we have the right to be forgotten and other forms of legislation. It may be that we need greater regulation at governmental level, and that would probably have to be coordinated between states. And of course, at the same time, libraries and archives, if you like, as more neutral, you know, we're not neutral, but we're more neutral, I would say, or more work on behalf of society. Could we be actually taking copies or preserving and archiving social media data or ad tech data on behalf of society, in order so that we can understand what's been going on in the first decades of the 21st century.
So I want to delve a little deeper here, because this is a subject that we at the National Library are spending a lot of time thinking about, and that is, what is the role? What is the role of the library, the big libraries? And if we go back to the model of that librarian in the 17th century with the copy of John Milton, the question is, what is the scope of our capacity? You know, especially given the rapid change, the multinational corporations who seem to have infinite wealth and looking into our souls. So who are we here? Are we that librarian who can take one book and put it aside for the long haul? Or do libraries have the capacity to play a more prominent role, whether it is in conversation with the big tech companies or working together I would love to hear what you're doing and how you think about it. I know you're involved in a number of digital consortiums. What are models that you think are effective in this reality?
Well, I don't think there's a single model that works. We have to do a whole variety of things, both individually and collectively as great libraries. And indeed as relatively small libraries can also make a difference here. And I think, we certainly have to be archiving, we cannot neglect the knowledge of the past, that material, like the medieval manuscripts, like early printed books, like archival documents. We have to continue to preserve those. That our challenge is doing that at the same time that we enter more seriously and more purposefully and at scale the digital world as well. And I think that is where we have to do individual things. So, many libraries now are archiving the World Wide Web, either at very large scale, like we're doing, or just individual selected websites. All of those things need to happen. Archiving social media is a much more difficult task, a more costly task. We've seen some good examples with the National Library of New Zealand asking citizens to donate their own Facebook profiles. So I think this is a really fascinating topic, project that's kind of live at the moment. The Library of Congress did do a negotiation with Twitter, but had to abandon that because of the cost of the task. And one of the ideas in terms of public policy that I put in my book is of a memory tax on the private superpowers in order to fund libraries and archives, in order to be able to work at the scale we need to with the resources that are required to do it. But I certainly think collaboration between libraries and archives across the globe is absolutely the only way that we can approach this as a sector, because no one library can tackle this on their own. And so the collaboration that we've just announced between the National Library of Israel and the Bodleian is a great example of the way that we can work together. And you've been, a leading institution in doing that kind of work. I'm the president of the Digital Preservation Coalition, which is looking very specifically at the preservation of knowledge created in digital form, and has many bodies, not just libraries and archives, but the World Bank, the UK Atomic Energy Authority, all kinds of organizations that have an interest in keeping information over a long period of time.
Okay, so we have work to do. I feel like we can talk for hours, but I'm mindful that we're coming on 9 o'clock. And as you probably noticed, we have a very active chat area. And my colleague Doron, thank you, Doron, has gathered the questions that have come up on the chat area. And so if you are willing, I'd like to pose some of them. And to our wonderful audience members, I want to apologize in advance that we won't be able to answer all of these questions. So I'm going to focus on the ones that I believe are substantive questions towards you. Jennifer asks, is there any part of the Bodleian open to the public? Is there an exhibition of important manuscripts as there is in the British Library?
Yes, is the short answer to that. When we're not in a national lockdown, you can come and visit us. We have both guided tours of our historic buildings, and we have free access to exhibition galleries, and we have 3 of those available to the public, and we have a whole series of public programs, lectures and events and all kinds of things. And we've also been active in taking exhibitions around the world. So we've taken whole shows to the Jewish Museum in New York, or to the Persian manuscripts to the State Library of Victoria, Melbourne, and so on. So yes, we certainly do, and we will be most welcome to come and visit us.
Great, thank you. This is from Jonathan. Increasingly, knowledge is published digitally and not on paper. How can that best be preserved, and what are the challenges versus storing books? So we've spoken about internet archiving, but we have not talked about digitally born material.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, one of the things I should say is that although the technology is you know, often complex, libraries and archives have been working on digital preservation now for, you know, 3 decades or more, and we've kind of pretty much figured out what the best approaches and what successful approaches there are to preserving born digital information. Our challenge is really twofold, I think: being able to do it at sufficient scale at the same time as we have the cost of um, uh, preserving the knowledge of the past, but also of keeping pace with the rapid change in technology. So, you know, the industry is one that evolves and changes its operating systems, its software, its approaches, often its hardware, changes very, very rapidly. And so being able to constantly do the research and development in order to keep up is one of the challenges, and is where collaboration, and through bodies like the Digital Preservation Coalition, or by working between institutions working together to share knowledge and approaches, we can do this better and more cheaply, more efficiently at scale.
Thank you. This question from Gladwin you touched on, but perhaps you can say a little bit more. How accessible and long-lasting will knowledge be with current massive digitization programs and technology changes so rapidly? I think this is a question about how do you deal with paper. As we know, what's ironic, anyone who works in a library knows that the older the material, the more stable it is, that the older paper is better than the more recent paper. And it's a big problem with digital formats because they do change all the time.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And, you know, we like to say that paper exists in regimes of benign neglect, and that's, but it actually survives remarkably well, whereas digital technology tends not to. And so it requires active participation on behalf of libraries and archives. Libraries and archives have to do digital preservation. You can't just leave it and hope it'll be there. We have to roll our sleeves up and actually do these tasks. And you know, I think my industry, if you like, or our industry, Raquel's and my industry, is remarkably successful at providing approaches and working together to do it. The two things we lack are the scale and the funding to do it to do it to the sufficient degree, and to keep pace with change.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to jump back in history a little bit for a change. And this question from John is, how has the destruction of the library at Alexandria been determined? Were there contemporary accounts?
So there are contemporary accounts. They're often quite kind of conflicting. They don't harmonize terribly much. All that we really know about the ancient library of Alexandria, given that there's no actual archaeological site where we can go and say, well, this was where the library was, is that there was a great library in the 2nd and 3rd centuries before the Christian era. And by the 3rd and 4th centuries after the Christian era, there was no library anymore. And we have, you know, records of documents being borrowed from the collection. We have, you know, the Pinakes, the ancient catalogue, or hints of what the catalogue was like. And from that, we know that there were many texts that no longer survive and that were at one point in the library. We know that there was the storage of knowledge, but also a community of scholars surrounding that storage in order to access those collections. But the ancient writers, unfortunately, don't really agree on the topic. So we know that the civil war between Caesar and Ptolemy resulted in a fire in which books were destroyed, but that didn't result in the fundamental destruction of the collection, because we know of later writers like Strabo and others who visited and used the library after those events. And there was a kind of, you know, there's an accusation that the Muslims in their occupation of Alexandria destroyed the library by putting the scrolls to heat the boilers for the baths. But again, this is a myth. This did not happen. So you know, really all that we know, that there was a great library, and that centuries later it wasn't there. And I think it's much more compelling to see this as the reaction of time taking effect, and the neglect and the lack of status and funding and support that happened over a long period of time.
I have to say, parenthetically, that one of the surprises from your book is how often libraries were harmed and rebuilt. I have to say that even I, who know how organic a library is and has to always be cultivated and developed, was surprised by how many libraries had to suffer. I mean, it's logical, had to suffer fires, and they were burned down, they were rebuilt, and it really opened my eyes about this ongoing everlasting process of building and rebuilding. There are two related questions on a subject that we didn't touch on, and so I want to raise them if you're game for a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay, so this is from Michael. It is amazing that with world literature classics currently being systematically removed from city and school libraries in the name of political correctness and sensitivity, you are not talking about this as perhaps a more serious destruction of knowledge than the destruction of specific libraries. And there's a related question by Francis. What about the removal banning of books due to political correctness?
Okay, so I think there is a difference between this aspect of censorship. I mean, I think that, the removal of books from libraries is, to me, an example of censorship, and the destruction of knowledge. So my book is about the destruction of knowledge. And I think taking books out of a library for, and stopping them being circulated is more on the kind of censorship side of things. So I'm not condoning it at all. I think it's a bad and wrong thing to do, but I don't think it's the same as destruction. If those books are taken out and burned, like in the 10th of May 1933 in Berlin, then yes, I would agree with you. But the simple kind of deselection of them is not the same thing. I think there is a kind of qualitative difference.
Mm-hmm. That's volume 3.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, who writes at length, and unfortunately I'm not going to be able to read it, but she's asking about in Canada, we've seen the destruction of the archives of Indian residential school records for different reasons. But certainly one is that former students may have chosen to have their records destroyed. And so she's asking about, do you allow for different needs by peoples who have suffered colonialism, economic exploitation, sexual abuse, etc., to not have their records be preserved? Or do you prioritize history, even though archival destruction might be the only personal or cultural agency victims might have over their abuse? Can we really have universal rules over archiving?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good question. I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's a very difficult one to answer generically. I think my gut instinct is always to support preservation, and you can there are ways of kind of redacting information which falls short of complete destruction, but might recognize the sensitivities that individuals have. And of course we have in Europe the Data Protection Act, which goes some way towards addressing those concerns. But I think, and again, one generation may feel differently from another about these things, and that's often where I think viewing this over the long spread of history is sometimes a better perspective, and one which libraries and archives should be kind of defaulting to, I think, and looking for more contingent short-term ways in which those kind of very legitimate concerns could be tackled. But I think it's all about working with those communities and entering a dialogue, I think.
It reminds me of so many examples that I have dealt with personally. Until recently, I was the curator of the Islam and Middle East collection, and we dealt with a lot of Palestinian cultural heritage materials at the National Library of different historical circumstances. But what I was just thinking about is we have a massive digitization project of newspapers primarily historical Jewish press, and more recently the early Palestinian press. And thanks to an agreement we signed with the Communist Party of Israel, we have scanned a newspaper called El Ittihad. It started in 1944. It's the only newspaper that started in pre-1948, pre the establishment of Israel in Arabic, that continues until today. And when we decided to scan and make this material available, there were actually questions and criticism that arose that we shouldn't publish it. Why? Because in the period of martial law for Arabs in Israel, in the first 2 decades of Israel, there was a lot of collaboration. And despite themselves under terrible circumstances, and shining light on that, which you would think is a good thing historically, could actually lead to complexity, because these are the same families today who would then have to deal with this very complicated history. I mean, there are many, many examples I can give, and so I have a lot of sympathy for this question. But in the end, we decided to scan it and make it accessible because of this commitment to preservation and open access over the long haul. Okay. Maybe let's say one more, 2 more. What do you have for?
One more, perhaps.
One more. Okay, so give me a moment. I'm just going to make sure I choose a good one. This is an interesting one. We'll end with this one. This is from Emily. Regarding social media information, is it possible for archives and libraries to collect too much information such that it can no longer be useful?
That's a very, very interesting question. And there is a kind of topic now which is referred to this area as the problem of digital abundance. Mm-hmm. So is there too much information recorded? And, you know, I think it's possibly too soon to tell. Of course, the kind of historian in me and the archivist in me sort of fight with each other, because there are techniques like sampling, which archivists are kind of very used to dealing with very, very large record sets where you can't afford to keep everything, but you can use sampling techniques to give a sense of what is there. And the historian in me says, yeah, keep everything. You know, as Robert Caro says in his great book Working, you know, turn every page. And you know, there are ways in which you can turn every page using new technology now, text and data mining, visualization. You know, these techniques are there to help sort through these massive bodies of knowledge bigger than any librarian has ever dealt with in history are being created today. So I think there are ways in which we can, it is possible to keep larger and larger bodies of information. Whether we keep everything, whether that is a kind of recipe for madness, I'm not sure we know fundamentally the answer to that yet.
Thank you so much, Richard. This has been delightful. I have learned a tremendous amount and very much enjoyed our conversation. So I want to thank you for your generosity in sharing this journey with us and the world. I want to thank Ambassador Wigan for being present here and for celebrating with our 2 institutions this historic agreement. And this indeed was an auspicious evening with many wonderful announcements. I want to thank our audience from across the globe who were so active and passionate about this subject. A number of people have asked if this event will be recorded, and so I want to make sure you read in the chat that it is being recorded, and it will be uploaded at the National Library of Israel's International Reading Room platform. If you haven't visited the Reading Room platform, I really encourage you to do so. There's phenomenal programming that goes on every week, a few times a week, and it's very heartening to know that even during a dark time in our world, that there's so much light, there's so much knowledge sharing and collaboration. So thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you, Raquel, and thank you to all my great colleagues in the National Library, to Oren and all his team. We're very grateful to you for the work that you do on behalf of the world, and we're excited to be working together in the weeks, months, and years to come.
Amen. All right, take care, everyone. Have a good night. Be safe, be healthy, and see you at the reading room. Take care.
Bye.